turn it over to Cliff to introduce our speaker tonight.
Great, thank you, Barbara, and welcome everybody. Thanks so much for joining us tonight in our monthly series on Conservation Today. And tonight we have Tom Stanley, who's going to give us a very fascinating talk on regenerative agriculture or sustainable agriculture. Tom grew up in Southwest Virginia and was an active member of the 4-H and the FFA. And he worked in livestock production from a 4-H sheep project at an early age, and local farms in high school, and beef cattle ranches, and a feedlot in western Nebraska and eastern Colorado when he was in college. He has a BS from Virginia Tech, and he has an MS from Kansas State University in animal science. I'm a little biased about Kansas State because a relative of mine was a professor there in genetics. After service in the U.S. Army, Tom joined the Virginia Co-op Extension in 1996 as an extension agent headquartered in Augusta County. And in 2010, he moved to our Rockkbridge unit. His specialization is business management, farm business management, how to keep things going. Tom's part of the agricultural extension agents serve Augusta, Bath, Highland, Rockbridge, and Rockingham counties. Areas of specialization include crop and soil science, animal science, commercial horticulture, and farm business management. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Tom. Thanks so much for coming tonight, everyone.
Super. Thank you, Cliff. Thanks for the introduction. I have more material here than probably I can cover in the allotted time, but I really appreciate and am flattered to have been asked by RAC to give this presentation, and I really am appreciative for those of you who have taken the time to join tonight. Now, my talk is very economics heavy and very focused on kind of what we're doing in agriculture right here, right now, today. Now, just bear with me because we'll get to the regenerative part at the end. But I want to kind of give us some background and underpinning to give some financial underpinning to when we talk about regenerative practices. I'm going to read from a script, so I'm going to be looking down a good bit. So Barbara and Cliff or whoever, if I need to stop or the slides aren't right or something, you need to holler at me and say, hey, I don't think you're right here. So, but I think I've got my cues on my script, and so I'll try and keep up. I've been practicing this, and I think we've got it in time. So I'm going to say 1, 2, 3, go, and I'm going to go. If you have a question, I'm going to pause what should be about 15 or 20 minutes in. If you got a burning question, feel free to interrupt. I don't mind. That'll be all right. But I am going to pause for breath and after we get through some of the economic stuff, and then and have a time for some questions in the middle. But we'll try and keep this informal, and I don't mind being interrupted either. So, all right. So I'm going to read from a script, and we're going to take off here. Thank you. I'm really appreciative and flattered to have been asked to be part of this series sponsored by RAC. And I appreciate each of you who made time to be here to join the conference call tonight. I got a great deal of material, and as I said, I'll be reading from a script. So I'll try not to sound like an automaton, but hopefully this will be of interest to everybody. Now I'm going to preface my presentation with 2 points. The first one is all my comments, I'm painting with a very broad brush. And my comments are based on a combination of collected data and anecdote. So there are exceptions to every generalization I make. So I'm going to speak in generalizations, and there are exceptions to those, but I think you'll get the general idea of the point I'm trying to make. The second is I'm going to devote a good amount of time to beef cattle production and beef cattle economics. Now, that's not because beef cattle are especially profitable, because they aren't. But beef cattle are the primary user of open land in the Appalachian region. And that's the primary reason most of the landowners in in this region only pay a fraction of the real estate tax that they would otherwise pay. And that's thanks to the agricultural land use assessment laws that we have on the books in Virginia. So beef cattle kind of have an outsized impact because of the significant land user that they are. Of course, these days we can't have a presentation without talking about the elephants in the room, and I don't know that we can fit too many more elephants in this room, but we all look forward to the day of getting the pandemic behind us, but there's a whole bunch of other elephants in the room we're contending with. Climate disruption is the one that I'll be probably touching on the most tonight. Here's an outline of what I'm going to cover. I'm going to start with a word about cultural traditions and the integral part that the perception and values of those that work in agriculture, how it plays into their perceptions of what they do. And then I'm going to delve into the economics of and reconciling the value of farm products relative to the cost of living, and end with some public policy approaches we might consider when we talk about regenerative practices. And finally, I'll pull on a speaker I heard and really appreciated, and he used the term bounce forward. In my opinion, we really need to be looking for a way to bounce forward. We can't just bounce back from the pandemic and back to where we were. We need to figure out a way to bounce forward. Now here's two cattlemen. One is in Southern Sudan and the other is a young man I know, Luke Grant. And he's a fine young man. He grew up raising cattle with his father near Brownsburg. And I submit to you that both these men would find they have a good bit in common. I'm showing you these pictures to illustrate the human face of agriculture and climate policy issues. In Sudan and other places like that, livestock are not just a business, but livestock represent status and position in society. And in some areas, the livestock are literally a form of currency. Now for Luke Grant back at Rockkbridge, there's nothing he would rather do than make his living raising cattle. And in this picture, we see him with some of the dairy steers he's bought as calves from local dairies, and he raised those calves on powdered milk replacer and later on pasture with his father's beef herd. And the Grant family, like so many families in Rockkbridge, with farming connections, they love their place, they love being on the land. And if you ask Luke, you say, Luke, are you making any money with these cattle? He'd say, well, a little bit. And that's pretty accurate. Cattle of this type are a way for someone with limited money to get a start with cattle and make a little bit of money. But the actual return on labor is pretty small. And that's where we get into this gross revenue profile of farms in Rockkbridge County. And this is quite consistent in all the counties up and down the I-81 corridor, a little bit different in the poultry counties. And of course, Rockkbridge is a poultry county. We'll touch on that. When we look at farms as a whole in Rockkbridge County, we see that very few of them make a full-time living at it. On the far left column are different levels of gross farm income. And in the adjacent column is the number of farms in each category. Now, the other Census of Agriculture data figure I'm going to use is the average expense ratio for agriculture production. That's about 85%. What that means is that for every dollar in gross revenue, about 85 cents goes right back out in expenses, and the farm operator only keeps about 15% of the gross. And when we make this calculation, we see that only about, if you can see my cursor, there's only about 12 farms that are making what we would say, or what I will say, and I'll talk about later, approaches a full-time living. And virtually all 12 of these farms are either dairy or poultry operation. There's a couple of them that just do beef, cattle, and grain, but the vast majority of them that are making their living at it are either contract poultry growers and or dairy operations. But the point here is that despite having so few people who actually make their living farming, we have this very strong local culture that identifies with farming and forestry. Now, allow me to delve a little more into this expense ratio, because I want to talk a little about that a little bit. For the small farms with lower amounts of gross income, that 85 expense ratio is generally a bit less accurate because both management and labor are provided by the operator. And so they're keeping more of that gross. It goes straight in their pocket. But as you move up through the levels of gross farm income, the operator begins to hire more custom work. They hire part-time or occasional help. And by the time we see farms that are grossing over 50,000 or more, then the expense ratio begins to approach that 85%. Now, let me kind of give you another illustration of this, is that I've talked to a number of really creative, active market gardeners, and they're good growers, and they can generate, like $20,000 off a single acre by retailing through CSAs and local farmers markets. But when they attempt to expand and grow that second acre, the labor and the marketing demands cause the expenses and thus the expense ratio to increase. So the net income realized from the second acre is much, much less. But I want to reiterate my main point here. Despite having so few people who actually make their living farming, we have a very strong local culture that identifies with farming and forestry. Now, this is a picture taken straight from the 1914 Yearbook of Agriculture published by USDA, and the caption reads, "Everybody in this country home goes to church every Sunday and are community builders. The quiet, peaceful homes in the country make a great national reservoir from which the large cities are constantly drawing energy, good habits, morals, and religion." Now, it's hard for us to imagine the federal government publishing such a caption today, but I submit to you this evening that this picture is the sentiment that's expressed in the caption are still very much a part of the worldview of many folks who live in rural areas in the United States. And we take this image and this thought that's expressed in this caption, we take it forward 106 years from 2014 to 2020, and we see clearly there's a difference in worldview between rural and urban communities. From the national electoral map, I've isolated 3 states that were quote unquote blue, all right? And when we look at those states, they were blue for the electoral college, but when you look at them individually, Minnesota, Virginia, and Pennsylvania, you can see it's a clear divide. You can tell what the rural counties are, and you can tell where the urban areas are, and you can tell where the colleges and the large colleges and universities are headquartered. So I'll put this really bluntly. Rural America controls the Senate. And this has a tremendous implication for national policy, especially agricultural policy in our country. This is a farm in Rockingham County I like to show when I'm talking about farm economics. This is a farm I've really enjoyed watching and learning from the guy who operates it. This is a 150-acre certified organic dairy in Rockingham County. The dairyman's been on this farm since 1999. It's been very successful. He does not own a single acre. He rents the whole thing. It's entirely leased. It's the 15-year lease from a family, and he's been very successful in that business. Price inflation in commercial agriculture. I'm going to show make a few illustrations here. The first commercially available round baler became available in 1973. And at that time, at the farm gate, the value of 7 slaughter steers could buy that piece of state-of-the-art equipment. A $4,000 round baler, you could buy it with the same equivalent value of 7 slaughter steers, or for a dairy, about 5,700 gallons of milk at the farm gate could buy you that state-of-the-art brand new round baler and transform your hay production system. Now we flash forward to today in 2019, the same state-of-the-art round baler is going to retail for north of $40,000. And it's going to take the equivalent value of 27 to 30 slaughter steers to buy that round baler. And it's going to take 4 times the amount of milk it took in 1973. It's going to take 24,000 gallons of milk at the farm gate to buy a brand new round baler. And we see this pattern of inflation across all farm products, whether it's cattle or milk or grain or fresh vegetables or fruits. All of them, we've seen the same distortion in the value of the farm product at the farm gate. The farm gate has not kept up with the cost of the capital input. So one of my mantras is about when we talk about farming in Western Virginia, I tell people we're a lot more like Ireland than we are Iowa. And for the past 70 years, since World War II, we've been trying to cram the square peg that is the Corn Belt farm business model into the round hole that is the Virginia countryside. And with the price inflation that I depicted in the previous slide, that's going to help explain why more and more often we're going to fail at this effort to replicate the Great Plains farm and ranch production model in Appalachia. So we're a land of small fields and difficult topography, but some individual fields have very good soils and are suited for high value crops. We are also situated within a day's drive of the wealthiest consumer market on the planet. On a per capita basis, the East Coast of the United States is by far the wealthiest consumer market on the planet. And I think we need to spend more time looking at ways to capitalize on that opportunity. Now, I'm about to make some comments on Virginia farm economies, and I'm going to reiterate, I'm painting with a broad brush here. So if I paint over somebody's known experience or closely held perception, I'll apologize. I'll be glad to visit with you after the presentation. I love talking about this stuff, but these are the perceptions I've formed from meeting with farmers and kind of observing what they do and seeing some successful ones and seeing some unsuccessful ones. Let's start with beef cattle. Beef cattle and hay production, as we said earlier, this is the big land occupier in our region. It is a land extensive business. That means it takes a lot of acres to generate a living income for a family. But beef cattle have a comparatively low labor requirement, and that's why they continue to be the go-to, is that labor requirement. Sheep and goats have some similarities with beef cattle in terms of land use and their suitability for our difficult topography. They also kind of have a unique opportunity on the East Coast because of our proximity to ethnic and religious communities that have a tradition of eating lamb and goat. However, small ruminants face some significant management challenges with internal parasites and predators, and we rarely encounter people in our farm communities who generate most or even a significant amount of their income from farming sheep and goats. And I think this is largely due to the management challenges that come with these animals. Dairy production has been one of the pillars of agriculture in our economy in the mid-Atlantic Appalachian region. But the constant pressure to achieve economies of scale, along with declining consumption of fluid milk, has resulted in a decline in our dairy industry. So on paper, the numbers tell us that it's possible to make a viable living with 100 cows. But the labor demand, the lifestyle demands are very daunting on most dairies. And that's why most of our dairies have tried to expand beyond just 100 cows in order to accommodate more hired labor so the operator can occasionally leave the farm. Organic dairying, certified organic dairying, now that was an enterprise I was really excited about at the beginning of this century. The first 12 years of this century, organic dairy was so promising. It was on a contract basis, had a guaranteed floor price, and really looked like a great opportunity for small family farms. Unfortunately, large organic dairies figured out how to meet the standard and produced large quantities of inexpensive organic milk in the West, and they have filled that market demand. And so our certified organic milk companies like Organic Valley, they are not taking on any new producers. So that's an opportunity that's essentially not accessible to our farms at this time. Contract poultry production. It's the remaining engine that pulls the train of Shenandoah Valley agriculture. It's been a source of controversy, and it's related to the financial commitment that's demanded of the contracting farmer and the environmental impacts of the industry. But it remains the enterprise that is primarily responsible for why the Shenandoah Valley has a larger number of full-time commercially viable farms than most other areas of the state. I think I might hear some people grinding their teeth right now, but this is something that has been a big part of Rockkbridge County and the Shenandoah Valley. And you know, it's been really important for allowing some young people entry into agriculture. Next is a collection of crops that are machine harvested. And you see them listed here. It's quite a diverse group of crops, but that's what they share in common, is that they're all machine harvested. And I hate to burst anybody's bubble here, but I think the future of these crops can be summed up in one sentence. Whoever has the most flat land and the biggest machine is going to win. And whatever you think about selling corn to the poultry companies up in Harrisonburg, or selling hops to the local breweries, or doing fiber hemp, there's a bunch of other states who are working on all those things. And they have more flat land and bigger machines than we do. And they're going to beat us every time. So, Barbara?
I've got a question in the chat for you, Tom, if it's okay to interrupt. The question is it possible for you to add livestock such as alpacas to this economic story for Rockkbridge?
Yes, and I think that's probably addressed down. I'm probably going to come to that in direct marketed ag products. Yeah, but to answer the question out of respect to the person who submitted the question, the short answer is yes. And that is possible to include that. It always comes back to volume relative to price received. And so, and I'm a sheep guy. You're going to hear that later on, and you know, and fiber and wool and all those things. You know, I'd love to see opportunities, and there could be, but it's a tough road. So, but I'll move on. I might kind of address that with direct marketed piece. And on that note, farm products market, is that okay? We get good enough answer, think out there? All right. Farm products marketed direct to consumer. This is primarily farmers markets. It's garnered a great deal of attention with the enthusiasm and interest in local foods. It's my observation, and talking to a number of different market gardeners, our most successful ones in our up and down the 91 corridor, they top out around $40,000 of gross per year. About $40,000 gross sales is where they're topping out. And that's per full-time equivalent person working, and they're working year round and working pretty darn hard. Direct marketing to consumers is very labor intensive and it's very time consuming. Now, let me allow to illustrate this with a quick anecdote. Now, I heard a very successful market gardener from Eastern Virginia speak at a conference, and I'm going to quote him. He said, "Yes, we are very fortunate on our farm. We have access to a large number of farmers markets within easy drive of our farm. We can go to Richmond, Williamsburg, or Norfolk. And our rule of thumb is we don't go to a market unless we are sure there's going to be 1,000 people there." Now, that was a light bulb moment for me, because when we look at our farmers markets up and down the 81 corridor, I don't know that I've ever seen 500 people at a market, let alone 1,000. And so even though we're capturing retail and we're selling a high quality, high value crop, we just can't move the volume through that direct marketing piece. So now, having said that, intensively managed wholesale crops, I think remains an area we need to look at and where we've got opportunity. And I'm going to focus on, my focus on high value annual crops like broccoli and sugar snap peas that are hand-picked and consumed fresh. That's where the money is. Or a crop like raspberries that has a short supply chain I mean, because we could grow a berry way better than those styrofoam things they send us from Mexico, okay? But it can't travel far. So I've got hemp on this list, the CBD hemp, and then there's an increasing buzz about THC hemp, a lot of interest in that. I want to say that crop, whether it's THC hemp or CBD hemp, it's got a very bumpy road to follow. Remember, it is a non-perishable crop, which puts it at a disadvantage. The net income per acre is directly proportional to labor requirement. So for a crop that's reached market equilibrium. So if we have a crop that's being touted out there as, oh, you're going to make $20,000 net income per acre, there's two things going on. One, it either has an extremely high labor requirement, or it's in some sort of supply deficit that is going to be quickly overcorrected. And frankly, that's where we are with hemp. It's going to be a very bumpy road. Eventually, what we're going to see with CBD or THC hemp is it's going to reach a market equilibrium, and in terms of net income per acre, it's going to look a whole lot like our management intensive fresh picked vegetables. It's directly proportional to management and labor requirements. So that said, I think these wholesale management intensive crops, what we see in other parts of the state where they're successful, and well, I don't say other parts of the state, I've got a grower up in Highland County who's realizing success now. And something between $1,000 and $6,000 an acre net income is absolutely within the realm of possibility for those crops. So it's something to look at. On that note, we're going to take a quick look at a county in the Appalachian Mid-Atlantic. These are pictures from Carroll County, Virginia. And here you see some of the pictures from the Southwest Virginia Wholesale Farmers Market in Hillsville. And I don't want to oversell this, but there are several dozen farmers down there who make their living growing produce. And I've had the privilege of working with a couple up this way that are slowly working their way into that. And they're doing it by moving volume and by securing a labor force through the H-2A program. So I think that's a bright spot and a place where we're going to see further development. In the interest of time, I practiced this earlier. I'm going to have to cut this short. The point of this slide is to illustrate that, I'm coming back to beef cattle because I'm going to take a pause here. When we look at beef cattle, and we already talked about this inflationary discrepancy that makes capital inputs so high that hay is really expensive to make. What we're recognizing, and more of our beef cattle producers are realizing, is they can reduce their cow numbers and manage their grazing so they feed hay fewer days out of the year and realize a significant increase in their net income per acre. It's still a land extensive enterprise. It still takes a lot of acres, but there's management opportunities even in these, what we'd say, kind of low profitability enterprises. But that's where we get into the challenges that we see with beef cattle. And I'm coming back to beef cattle because once again, they're the big land user. And here is kind of a schematic of the typical Virginia beef cattle herd in Rockkbridge and all up and down the I-81 corridor and a lot of other parts of Virginia. Remember, we're a lot more like Ireland than we are Iowa. So all the land is owned in relatively small parcels. So what our beef cattle producer who wants to work beyond just their own limited at-home parcel is first thing they do is they secure these outlying parcels. And one of the first opportunities they find are these outlying parcels that are not fenced, they don't have water, they don't have any infrastructure, and it's an opportunity to go make hay. And I have heard it said and heard this identified as free hay. That is not free hay, okay? That hay is not free. We have producers who have the capital to do it, and they've got the equipment to do it, but we're realizing more and more this is not free hay. And when we look at opportunities to manage grazing and try and manage these cows at remote locations, labor efficiency and opportunities for more intensive management of our livestock really are diminished when we're scattered like this around a lot of different places. So, all right, I'm going to draw a breath. I know I've got y'all kind of drinking from a fire hose here, but if we got burning questions, I'll be glad to take them before I jump back in. Y'all can hear me okay?
Tom?
Yes.
You showed the picture of the wholesale market down in Carroll County. Where would the local or the closest wholesale market for our region be for Rockkbridge County farmers?
The three outlets that come to mind, one would be the Shenandoah Valley Produce Auction. That's up in the Old Order Mennonite country, southwest of Harrisonburg. Now that's kind of a unique market outlet, but that's a wholesale opportunity that's been a really good segue, kind of an entry point for guys that wanted to kind of experiment with produce. The other one that comes to my mind is Local Food Hub in Charlottesville. They've been really great to work with. You kind of need to, you got to communicate with them in advance and kind of strategize in terms of what crop you're going to grow and when you're going to have it there. But Local Food Hub in Charlottesville has been a good outlet. And then we got a number of wholesale buyers. Now breaking into the more traditional wholesale market is a little bit trickier. And price point can be really challenging, but because it's pretty low. But guys that figure out how to produce volume are finding some opportunity there. So,
Tom, I have a question about leasing. You mentioned one successful dairy farm that was leasing all their land. Most of the land in Rockkbridge owned or leased, and who's doing better, the leasers or the owners?
Well, it's I haven't delved into the census to kind of try and tease out what proportion of land's leased, and that's a pretty tough number to come up with. But suffice it to say, most of the open land that's farmed, I would be comfortable saying probably most of it is leased. That's a guess. But who's the more, the typical rental rate would range anywhere from, for pasture land, will range anywhere from $12 to up to maybe $30 an acre. And that differential depends on location. We generally see, for Rockkbridge County, we see higher rental rates in the northern half of the county. And that's because of the presence of several dairy and poultry operations that are competing for land. And also you got folks coming down from Augusta trying to rent land. But to answer your question, if you own it, you don't got to pay rent. So you put more of that money in your pocket. That's probably the short answer. So,
thank you.
But there are guys that are able to successfully rent land. Yes, Cliff.
Tom, you mentioned Carroll County and showed us some very interesting images of crops down in Carroll. Could you compare Carroll to Rockkbridge? Would Rockkbridge have as good of soils and qualities or similar to Carroll? So seeing the success in Carroll might mean we could be successful?
Yeah, in fact, that's a good question. And that's why I highlighted Carroll, because Carroll County topographically, geologically, and demographically are very similar to Rockkbridge. I mean, people who are native to Rockkbridge could really relate to people from Carroll County. The topography is similar, although now Carroll is an interesting county because it's perched right there on the Blue Ridge Plateau. So there's a huge altitude variation, because for instance, that field of broccoli was at about 2,300 feet, and they can do broccoli right through the summer because they're high enough and cool enough. They can, that particular farm, they can do broccoli all the way through the summer. We get too hot. We're too low, and we don't have the elevation. And so we're too hot to do broccoli right straight through the summer. Now that's just an example. But now and I met a farmer down there. He had sweet corn growing up just above Hillsville at about 2,300 feet elevation. And he had more sweet corn at the bottom of the mountain in Cana, which is down close to the North Carolina border. And that's at about 800 feet of elevation. And so he had a marketing strategy that for how that sweet corn would come in over a period of weeks. Right. And the big challenge with produce is that you get wacky weather, and this gentleman in particular, he had a horror story, really got jammed up because we had a particular weather pattern that impacted Carroll County, and it got unusually warm for the whole county. And so all that sweet corn that was going to come in over a period of 8 weeks came in a period of about 4. And so he had a bunch of sweet corn, and the contract was for it to come in over 8 weeks, and it all came in 4. And he took a licking is what he took. So, but a lot of comparisons. It is different. They got higher elevation, but a lot of similarities. It's not all flat, that's for sure. Barbara?
There's another question on the chat, Tom, wanting to know about something you said about non-perishable crops having a problem, and could you explain what that means?
Well, with how best I'll give you a quick illustration. I've worked with a farmer here in the region. I'll just say in the region, and that did CBD hemp, and he currently has ownership interest in something like I think he told me like 75 gallons of CBD oil. And so CBD oil that's the crown jewel. That's the refined product that has such high value. And he's sitting on that inventory, and they're just waiting on the market. And so whoever is thinking of growing CBD hemp next year, well, you may see a market price of, well, there's an inventory of that product that's sitting there waiting to be brought in. Now, you can't do that with broccoli. You can't do that with sugar snap peas, okay? Can't do it with raspberries, but you can do it with THC hemp that's ready to get rolled into cigarettes or whatever, or and to a certain extent, grains, commercial grains like number 2 yellow corn. You can sit that in the bin and you can sit there for 2-3 years. You can also do it with wool. The big sheep operations out in the West, and wool market's no good. And there's a certain amount of that. If it's really good quality wool, they'll sit on it. And as soon as the market opens up, they dump that wool on the market. So that's what I mean by non-perishable crops. They can kind of get brought out of inventory and are a damper on the market. I got a bunch more here. I might all move on. But I appreciate the question. So I've painted a pretty daunting picture. The economics is the dismal science, and we're talking about essentially returns with these cattle $80 per acre. So why do people do this? What motivates us to do this? And here it comes back to these cultural connections with the land. Why do I enjoy keeping my sheep? Well, I think one is that opportunity for independence and control over decisions and management. Enjoyment, sense of accomplishment. And if you've ever done farm work, when you do a project where it's build a fence or mow a field or vaccinate a bunch of animals, I mean, you can tell when you're done, and there's a real sense of accomplishment with it. Connection to nature and the seasons, to be outside, and it's a really, as long as you don't get hurt, it's super healthy. I mean, get out and physically active and enjoy the outdoors. As I said, most of us are part-time farmers, so supplemental income and provides flexibility. A lot of these, like keeping livestock, there's a fair bit of flexibility in terms of when we do it. And particularly now we have LED headlamps, it's a lot more flexible. So scheduling that farm work around your day job, and supplement your income. But then I've met some families, there's a sense of obligation, there's a sense of duty. And I've encountered some people that, the last word that the parent or grandparent told them on their deathbed was, don't lose the farm. So now we've talked about part-time farming. We have a lot of people aspire to make their living farming. And so what does the successful farm business look like? Now, these are my benchmarks, and I think these apply to a lot of self-employed people. I don't think it's necessarily strictly confined to farming, but I'm going to couch it in the context of farming. So what are the benchmarks for a successful self-employed farmer? Like a lot of other aspects of the American economy, we value, and that's a classic way to build equity, is you own your own home. You got to cover your health insurance costs, either through self-insuring or buying health insurance. Talk about an elephant that's in the room. We'll talk on, maybe touch on that here in a little bit. The business operator can save and help support for the education of children and cover their expenses later in life when they can no longer work. You got to pay your taxes. And for the self-employed person, there has to be a market risk premium. What's a market risk premium? There has to be a reward for stepping out there and exposing yourself to all the volatilities and risks of weather and market. Because if I'm only going to make $40,000 a year farming, well, I could go to town and get a job in a factory or with the government or whatever and make $40,000 and cover those first four, pay the taxes, have health insurance, own my own home. And then I could farm on the weekend and supplement that 40,000 with supplemental income from part-time farming. So if we're going to farm full-time, we've got to consistently do better than what we do if we just go work in town. Now there's a lot of folks that if they could farm full-time, they'd take less. There's a lot of folks that, yeah, I'll live on $40,000 a year. If I could farm full-time, I'd do it. But the issue, look at my cursor, healthcare. And I had a colleague, he made a funny comment, and it's absolutely true. You know, what is the secret to all the marriages in the Shenandoah Valley that hold together on farms? Well, because the spouse brings home health insurance. So that's a often, I think, underestimated issue. I talk to a lot of farmers. I know a farmer here in Rockkbridge County that's very successful. He's got 2 equipment sheds full of really nice equipment, runs cattle, has some other enterprises. His wife works a minimum wage job in the school system, and she provides health insurance. So she's making more than minimum wage because she's bringing home something probably equivalent about $12 an hour just in health insurance. So anyway, I'm back chased down a rabbit hole here. I need to keep moving. Let's see. So farms that are successful, what do? They're going to scale up. They're going to rent land. Okay. And we talked a little bit about land rental. And in the interest of time, I want to keep moving here. But the point I want to make here is land stewardship is not a 12-month proposition. The vast majority of our farmland is rented on a year-to-year basis. And a lot of times it's just a verbal agreement. There's nothing written. And they talk at Christmas time. You gonna rent it next year? Yeah, I'll rent it next year. Everything okay? Well, you need to fix that fence. You know, that's about sometimes the extent of the conversation. But as those operations grow and as they try to expand their income potential, and they rent more and more land, then we get to a situation, very common, a lot of our full-time farms, they only own about 30% of the land that they're operating on. That's for your land extensive operations, the cattle and the grains, and maybe they got poultry houses, but they actually operate on the amount of land they own is a fairly small fraction of what they are relying on to operate. And just to illustrate this this quickly, I'll make sure I'm keeping up with my script here. This is a farm in Rockkbridge County. I'm familiar with it. And I understand the land rental agreement. It's a year-to-year lease, and the guy pays to run cattle on it. If you look on the USDA soil survey, the underlying soil is a Frederick Silt loam, which is a soil of statewide importance. It's a good agricultural soil. And I'll make sure I'm not missing anything. Yeah. This farm, that's the certified organic dairy that's leased in Rockingham County. Same soil type, Frederick Silt loam. It's a Frederick Silt loam. It's a Frederick Silt loam. The only difference between these 2 farms is the land rental agreement. This is a year-to-year verbal agreement. This is a 15-year written agreement where the farmer has the opportunity to realize return on stewardship practices, everything from lime, fertilizer, and seed. All those take years to recapture that investment. And so that relationship between landowner and tenant is really important. So opportunities for the future, I think we've already touched on these. I think is fresh hand-picked crops, and I think and I don't come from that culture, you know, so the learning curve to move into something so totally different, that's a very steep learning curve to try and change enterprises and seek opportunity. But I'm seeing some young people with the heart and the enthusiasm to try and achieve that. And I think it's the potential's there. And we're finally kind of getting to the part where let's talk about some regenerative practices. I hope we're at an inflection point here in public policy that we can start paying more attention to carbon sequestration. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But scale, volume of sales, labor efficiency, those still matter. It's not going to go away. And that's why I've spent the vast majority of this presentation kind of hitting on that, because we cannot avoid it. I have read and listened to a lot of stories in the media, and they're great, where they feature a young person and they're getting their start and they got the pasture poultry and they show pictures of the chickens pecking around in the vegetable patch, and they're direct marketing through a farmer's market, and they got pasture raised pigs, and that's great. But they never ever talk about cash flow or the marketing plan. Of course, the reporter's not going to talk about that, but we never really hear about those operations in year 10 or year 15, because the person that can generate $20,000 a gross off an acre, well, that's great, but who wants to live on $20,000 a year with no health insurance? So that brings us back to our countryside and our rural identity, our cultural connections, and where we are with our carbon crisis. And I'll say it, I think we're in a carbon crisis. There's a lot of folks who look at this landscape and they say, you know, Virginia's always been a forest. That's what it wants to be. And these little farms are super inefficient. They're not a big source of our food. And they got things like these little sheep out here that are just big methane emitters. So really what we need to do is just plant trees, you know, and just tell those people go find something else to do and grow trees. But I think we have a pretty good idea what happens when we steamroll cultures and steamroll people. And if you don't know, we can find lots of examples, and probably a kind of a small one we saw in France, if you heard about the Yellow Vest protesters, because they brought the country to a halt. And what they were people who lived out in the country. And when France tried to implement a fuel tax to address carbon issues, they forgot or neglected to address rural people who don't have access to public transport and who depend on vehicles. And those people occupied the capital and occupied the streets of France and brought the country to a halt. And so what happened? You know, the whole process of trying to address, for public policy, trying to address the issue just fell flat and came to a halt. So how do we avoid that? How do we get to a place where we all can kind of collectively get on the same page? I think there's an opportunity where we can get to regenerative practices. We can maintain our connection with our traditions and continue to farm, but just do it a little differently. And it's going to cost some money. And I will say, and this is my opinion, there's some who say we could probably implement a free market system that, and I don't think that'll work. I don't think to do it strictly as a free market between industry and agriculture is not going to work, because Uber and Facebook and United Airlines, there is no way that they're going to put the kind of money into rural communities to offset their carbon emissions. In my opinion, it's going to take government policy and USDA programs to really move the needle on how we manage our landscapes. So going back to our model here, when we look at regenerative practices on a practical basis, first, the economics are driving our cattlemen to, one, I would say, look down here on these outlying parcels, we're going to drop those. And some of those folks that currently get land use value taxation, they're going to have to figure out another way to do it. And it may be through carbon policies, you know, planting trees or something like that. But we just can't afford to continue to make hay on those outlying parcels. And for the cattlemen, also looking much more strategically about how we use stored hay, stored feed, and where we can graze livestock, managing that differently. And if we have, for example, national policies that award the farmer for maintaining a certain vegetative cover and increasing their carbon footprint or increasing their soil carbon, that's what I'm trying to say, that just like the economics of it, this would provide a further incentive. They're going to reduce the stocking rate. Now, we still may have high stocking densities at times, but the overall number of cattle per acre would go down, and it could still make economics sense, especially if we have an underpinning of a reward for the carbon that change could bring about. And then further incentives for a range of practices that further, you know, bring in carbon. Now, pricing this carbon is really challenging because we know that it's more valuable to stop the emission than it is to pull it out of the atmosphere. If we stop the emission in the first place, it doesn't get out there and do damage. If the carbon's already in the atmosphere, it's already been up there and doing some damage. So that's a balancing act because we've got to have buy-in from rural people. We have to have people on the land who are bought in and incentivized to participate and believe in the policy. All right, so I don't know where we are on time. I'm having a good time. I hope y'all are. I've got 2 case studies I want to show you. I think it's going to take about 10 more minutes if you'll bear with me. One's kind of negative. The other one I think is pretty positive, but the first one I talk about is a case study in terms of the implementation of public policy that where we kind of see a regenerative practice, and that is the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program. That was a program that started in the mid-90s, right after I joined Extension, started my career in Extension, and it's an expansion of the Conservation Reserve Program, which brought cropland out of production in the Midwest and the Great Plains. But it was Conservation Reserve Enhanced because it was designed to focus on riparian areas around streams and wetlands. So here's the schematic, what it looked like. You had a farm with a stream, perennial stream, and cows and calves. Now, what policy forgot was that in many cases, the person operating the farm and the person who owned the land are 2 different people. And sometimes in the implementation of agricultural policy, we forget that little point. So here's how CREP worked, or has worked and continues to work. It's been modified, been a lot of complaints about it, and to USDA's credit, they've gone back, and so has the state of Virginia. They've come up with a lot of alternatives to provide more flexibility. But here's fundamentally how we saw it unfold. The landowner got paid, or rather was assisted in putting in fence around the stream. So they fenced off the stream, planted trees, and provided alternative water. And the government footed a big part of that bill. And depending on the width of the buffer, even today, now, there's some of these programs where you can get 100% of it paid for. But generally about 75% of the cost of the fence and the water and the trees was provided by the government. In exchange, the landowner signed a 15-year contract, right? He signed a 15-year contract and he got paid, let's see, make sure I got my, here we are. Now, I want to forget. Once we installed this program, we got a 15-year contract on the land. After a couple of years, what came in were non-native invasives. So you had autumn olive, multiflora rose, and paradise trees, and they didn't have the courtesy to stay in the riparian area. They got out in the pasture too. And so, I don't know if y'all could see it. So the landowner's getting paid something like 3 times normal rental rate. The farmer didn't get anything. He's got a water trough he's got to keep an eye on where the cattle used to drink out of the creek. And he's got what he sees as a weed patch. So farmers, as a general rule, they don't like CREP, okay? Now some farms have some farmers, particularly on their own land, they've capitalized on it and they've put in some really nice grazing systems and they've really taken full advantage of it. But there's a lot of farmers that provide some backgrounds why they weren't particularly happy. So what was the piece that was missing was this annual maintenance. And who's the person that could potentially do that annual maintenance piece? Well, the farmer, right? So, but there wasn't any money in there for that to pay them. Now, occasionally you saw landowners step forward and say, hey, I'll pay you to go out there and control the weeds, but that's the exception, not the rule. Whoops. Now, there it is. So here's another case study. This is from New Zealand, and their red meat sector has been really active in adopting some carbon capturing policies. And the reason is, I'm going to preface this, New Zealand, the pattern of land ownership is very different. If they're isolated, they don't have near the population density. And so most of the land, the real estate value is more closely tied to the potential return on agriculture. And so that really changes the dynamic. The other thing is New Zealand is at the bottom of the world. Everything they grow is exported. And they know that if they want to put their lamb or their beef into Western Europe or United States, they've got to be able to show that they are a good actor, that they are, and they are well on their way to carbon neutrality. So I'm going to hit the play button and I hope this video works.
One of the things that we're always working on is making the farm more efficient. When we took over 22 years ago, first year land percent was about 8%. Now we're not really 40%. And 80 weeks from 19 kilos to 28 kilos. So we made some big gains in this particular case range. We have less ewes than we used to have. We're still producing the same number of land, 10%.
A lot of us can't hear the video.
Oh, okay.
Tom, can you tell us what they're saying?
I'm sorry. I can hear it pretty well, and I regret that y'all can't. I'm so sorry.
Tom, it's gone completely silent at my end. Do you think you could maybe just give it a little bit of a summary? We're at 8 o'clock right now. Yeah. We did start a few minutes late, and there is at least one question in the chat. So if you're willing to stay just a little bit longer and to do that, we'd appreciate it.
Well, I think it might be more a question if the listeners are willing to stay and put up with me a little longer. I am about done, and I appreciate y'all's patience. I regret that you weren't able to hear the video. Basically, what you heard from those two farms, what you would have heard, and that maybe we can provide the link later. What you would have heard was an example of how those two farms have they've improved their livestock production efficiency, and then there's a program, a government program in New Zealand that pays them to set aside less productive land and install carbon sequestering practices. So I regret we lost that time and you didn't get to hear the video. It's pretty neat to hear those the story those folks have to offer. They're way ahead of us, but I think we've got potential application for similar policies here. At my last slide, I'll reference that link so you can maybe look that up, or you're welcome to email me. I want to end with this, with just a couple real quick points about, you know, I think I just can't overemphasize how important I think it is that how important it is we engage people that work the land. If we want to get serious about sequestering carbon, that we can't just say, well, how we say, I want to put this positive, rather than saying what you're doing is bad and you need to change, rather we need to afford you the opportunity to do something new and something addition to what you do already that contributes to the problem of carbon. And that's kind of what the video illustrates. I want to touch on a more positive note, and my Doug Avery is a big time commercial New Zealand farmer, and he went through some pretty tough times, dealt with clinical depression and very nearly lost his farm, but recovered. And in his podcast that I'll reference, and you'll be able to search it up on the internet, he talks about 4 things critical to the successful farm business: love, connection, purpose, and hope. And that's a really touchy-feely thing. And I wouldn't get in front of a group of farmers and necessarily hit them with that right off the bat. But I have sat in the kitchen, across the kitchen table, sat down with an old crotchety old farmer who's pretty darn successful, and we're sitting down looking at balance sheets, and he wants to talk about the farm business structure and how to organize it and marketing plans. But you get him talking, he'll hit all 4 of those, because he'll start talking about his granddaddy. His granddaddy has started that farm and how he raised his children on that farm, and then how now he's got grandchildren that are riding around with him in the pickup. And he'll hit all 4 of those: love, connection, purpose, and hope. And this slide you can look at later. We're running late, but it's about applying love, connection, purpose, and hope to how we manage the land, and realize that the people who live out here, people live in rural communities, no matter how they voted, love, connection, purpose, and hope are important to them. And so when we look at regenerative practices, I think if we can construct regenerative practices that connect with that level of people's connection with the land, then we're in a place where we can all work together and we can all pull together. And that this is a statement I'll end on, that in order to restore our planet's carbon balance, we got to get active participation from farmers and loggers and others who work on the land. These are people that they know hydraulics, they know how to work heavy equipment, because they're going to need to handle biomass. And we're going to have to be innovative about the way we handle biomass. And these guys, men and women, they're good mechanics, they're creative, they can make things work, but they got a cultural connection to a particular spot, and it's a place that they call home. So that's where I'll end. Here's 3 things I would highlight, and this lecture's tonight, and this a little bit kind of, some of it went over my head, but right now through BBC, the Wreath Lecture Series, this guy, Mark Carney, he's a former Bank of England governor, and I heard his first of 3 lectures. He's doing the second one tonight, and he's doing the third one next week. I would encourage you to look that up. If you just go to your search engine and type in Mark Carney 2020 Wreath lectures. You can pull those up, and it's really interesting what he's got to say in terms of the free market and where we've been and maybe some changes we need to make to our free market approach. Another book, a book that I'd highly recommend, James Rebanks. He's got another book out now called Pastoral. I read his first one, The Shepherd's Life, Dispatches from an Ancient Landscape. He's from Northern England and has dealt, and in that he talks about, you know, growing up, wanting to farm and trying to figure out a way to do it. And he essentially was a high school dropout. And because all he wanted to do was farm. And it's a very compelling memoir. And it's not just about sheep, although I'm really into sheep, but he talks about deeper questions related to rural people and how people are connected to the land and their relationship to the rest of the world. And then finally, that Beef Lamb New Zealand website, lots of technical stuff there for us farm types that we really dig that. But there's also some really cool things. They've got a really neat learning module on climate change that applies to livestock producers that, you know, I think is pretty interesting. That was where that video came from. So I'm sorry the video didn't work, but and I'm sorry I ran long, but thank you for your patience, and I'll finally quit.
Fantastic. For those of you who can stay, maybe we'll stay on a few more minutes if Tom's willing for a couple of last minute questions. Please look for the recording on the RAC website. If you want to go back over any of this, it'll be available there probably in the next couple of days. There is one question from the chat, Tom, and that is about wineries and the emergence of wineries in the region and what sort of, I guess, economic picture there are for those, given our soils, topography, climate, and whatever.
I guess I'll be honest, I was kind of slow to come to kind of wake up to the opportunities of wineries, and wineries are great. Virginia wine has done really well, and but they are an example of how we capitalize on this very wealthy consumer market that is the East Coast. And because when you look at the overwhelming majority of our wineries, they are destinations. Okay, so they have a tourism component where they're open to the public, have people coming in to taste wine and use different cheeses and all those things. And as a way to kind of diversify the rural landscape and the rural economy, yeah, it's good. The reason why I don't get real excited about it is that is the primary market outlet. We're not like a Napa Valley or like South Australia that's going to mass produce, grapes and have tanker loads of grape juice that goes for mass wine production and making Boone's Farm and that kind of thing. It's more of a specialty niche thing. And so the economics term is barrier to entry. And so the barrier to entry to the local vineyard is very high. You better bring some money to the table. Whereas sugar snap peas or broccoli, if you got the labor, you're willing to get out there and work, it doesn't take too much to get in it. So then you just got to be willing to do the work and figure out the market channels.
Hey, Tom?
Yes.
Hey, the one thing that I'm looking as a hopeful thing is when farmers do recognize the need to sequester carbon and that we can change the economics like through a subsidy or a fee for that service, environmental service. But they also, I'm hoping that they can relate to the recognition that the buildup of emissions is a problem. I don't think that has happened yet, but I still see that potential. And I don't want to, just assume that can't happen because it hasn't. But the role the farmer can play can be heroic because really they have, we can do things to reduce emissions and that's important, but they have the the ability to sequester through plants, whether it be trees or crops that put carbon in the soil. And I recently was exposed to a video that was pretty dramatic. This scientist, Walter Jenhay, who talked about creating a sponge of the earth so that it holds water. And so that beyond the carbon it holds, and that reduces some cooling for, you know, the macro of the world, but the micro of the local climate presents us cooling by creating a hydrologic of more plant cover. And the potential of that is enormous. So it's a matter of us affirming that role that they can play, which is heroic. You know, if we see a common challenge. So that's what I'm looking for, is a recognition and changing the economy so that they will be affirm and have some economic security.
I think that's an excellent point. You know, and you know, and that's that. I appreciate your word. You know, affirming. You know, there are a lot of aspects. You know, what our traditional folks on the land. You know, we see resistance to like the riparian fencing, and they don't want to keep cattle out of the stream. And you know, we can kind of dwell on those negatives all day, but I think as far as really building that connection and affirm them and the good things they do, and create these incentives. You know, if we have, for example, just like what you're saying, you know, if there's an incentive for additional, for the carbon we sequester that's within 50 or 100 feet of a stream, then all of a sudden we've created an incentive to fence the stream, as opposed to, you know, the track we're on now, which is a kind of a mandated, get them out or you're in trouble. So, and I think the political landscape tells us we may kind of have to, even if they're not really perfect, that's our best way to bring them along and be affirming and constructive, so we can get constructive work done.
Yeah.
Is there a model, Tom, maybe from the New Zealand case, for that economic return that would work, you think, here in our sort of Irish situation in Virginia? You know, how is that money funneled to the person who is managing the land, as opposed to owners, or is there a different ownership farming situation in New Zealand?
Well, certainly the economics, the pattern of land ownership, you know, they were working over more land area. So from what little I know about the program and tried to become familiar with it, that certainly is a factor. Is, you know, the total land area over which you can apply those carbon capturing practices. But, you know, as far as the model, I think we're kind of the one to look at, and the one that farmers are most familiar with is already through the Natural Resource Conservation Service, in this with the Conservation Reserve Program and similar things that, you know, if you kind of start with kind of tweaking those and modifying those, that's something that's kind of familiar territory. And granted, there's a lot of farmers who are very cynical about it, but they're pretty familiar with it. The other thing we got to kind of caution about, and I don't want to go too far down a rabbit hole here, but with all these government programs, it is inevitable. There are guys that are going to game the system. Mm. We saw that with CREP, and that just goes to the territory. And in fact, the land grant university system puts out calculators and help farmers calculate how to maximize their government payment. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just that programs, they get started and I guarantee you're going to find problems and throw rocks at it, and they evolve over time. That's what we've seen with the Conservation Reserve Program and the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, and all those federal programs that have kind of been tweaked and improved over time to tailor to the needs of farmers and what really works.
The chat, there's one more question related to this, which is on the CREP funding from the federal government. What is the source of funding from that? Who is paying those taxes, or if that's the source of funding?
Yeah, it's taxpayer dollars. And you know, it's a federal appropriation, and it's a contract. It's a 15-year contract. So the federal government's made these commitments on the Conservation Reserve Program, Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program. You know, they've made those, or they're bound to those payment streams by contract. And I know and then for farmers, you know, and for a lot of folks, you know, that's pretty distasteful. They really don't like that concept and would prefer something more of a free market-based system. But rural America and our farm system works very closely with the government, and you don't have to dig too far into the accident to see the amount of money that the federal government has poured into farms in the past.
Doesn't Joel Salazan's operation offer a model that's not subsidized?
Oh yeah,
and it's regenerative.
Yeah, he direct markets. He retails his product. That's probably a big difference.
Yeah, I see.
You know, yeah, it's a pretty fraught. You know, Joel's a super guy. I mean, I've enjoyed hearing him speak, and he's really innovative. He's strong libertarian though. He's
sure.
Not a big fan of people like me, but no, he didn't mean that negative. I mean, we smile and shake hands. He's a good guy, but yeah, he's there's a lot of people very skeptical of government involvement. I'm a G man, and I think there's a role for government in this. So. Yeah, it's just
I'm looking for carbon to be priced, and that is a funding source. Now, that's a very controversial thing, obviously, because that increases the burden if you have a high component of fuel use. But with that, you can compensate the sequestration, and it's kind of a nice balance there between, you know, charging for emissions and then compensating for the sequestration. And therefore, the best program, and this is not in place, this is what I hope will happen, not what is in place, that it's a performance base. In other words, you have to show performance for the compensation and not say, you know, like you get this money because you do these X, Y, and Z, but not necessarily achieve the performance. Yeah.
Yeah, if I would interject real quick on that note, that's where I didn't have time to address it, but you know, that image I showed, the theoretical farm, the artist rendition with the trees and the lanes and the pasture lanes and crop areas. I think we're on the cusp of some really neat technology with remote sensing, whether it's LiDAR, drone overflights that through remote sensing can track carbon accumulation that could really facilitate exactly what I think you're alluding to, is that would incentivize that annual maintenance and management that really fosters the tree growth and fosters vegetative cover, so that we can actually visually with technology measure that carbon on the landscape and reward the land manager for accomplishing that.
Throw something in there.
Go ahead, David. Go ahead, David.
One thing though is performance standards come with a huge technological and personnel price tag. I can, at the cost of a year and several students and grants to buy my equipment, measure carbon annually on a soil or on a farm. But it's not easy and it isn't cheap. And right now, the cost of measuring carbon is probably equal to the payment that anybody's going to be able to come up with that carbon. So I think we can get there, but that's where design standards sometimes have an opening, is that if there is something you can do and you expect in this climate or for these kinds of soils, you're going to expect this kind of return, that's a whole lot easier to administer.
And that would be consistent with what they've done with other programs too.
Well, we've gone about 20
also
minutes.
We're in a time of...
excuse me, Eli, we've gone about 20 minutes past what we intended. And thank you, Tom, for being so gracious. Is there anybody who has not had a chance to ask a question, who would like to ask a parting question, or shall we wrap it up?
Or is there anybody still left? It might just be us.
We're still here.
Well, I appreciate everybody's patience. I know I went on too long.
And I do appreciate you staying a while so that I could share some of those thoughts. And
sure.
would like to imagine we've got big changes coming up. Well, this is going to be an age of innovation in these next 10 years. And there's exciting, and this is one of the big areas that potentially.
Great point. Thank you so much, Tom.
I enjoyed it. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
And thank you, everybody.
Yeah, I didn't put my email on there. Barbara can get you my email. And if there's any of this stuff you saw, I'm glad to share it. So.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Merry Christmas. Thank you.
Same to you.